The project life cycle and project development life cycle, these are two separate terms. Before PMBOK 6, PMBOK was not explicitly clear about it. When we talk about project life cycle, it's generally which binds something project from its starting to end. It could be a generic life cycle which starts about doing feasibility for the project, planning for the project, doing the work or developing something for the project results, and finally handing over output to the end customer. So the whole idea of starting in a project and ending in a project is covered in a frame of project life cycle. Now, in the whole project life cycle, there will be few phases which were linked to development of the product or service for which this project has been initiated. Now, the development part of this project life cycle has its own life cycle. Since the development is usually a complex process and the whole development goes through multiple stages, and we do need to control or look at the development starting till development get finished, and that part of life cycle is many times called development life cycle. The development life cycle, the phases are too much domain specific. Developing a construction building and developing a power plant and developing a software solutions will go through different stages, different phases, and the complete life cycle will look differently. But at a top level, the way planning and executing activities are organized, we can categorize these development life cycles under predictive, iterative, incremental, adaptive, and hybrid. This is how the PMBOK 6 look at them. Now, the predictive life cycle is most easily understandable life cycle. It is something that I want to develop some product, so I start visualizing that this is the product I want to develop at my end, and I plan how I can develop this particular product. Since I know what is needed in the beginning itself, though the project delivery may take 12 months before it get developed, but I define the scope, I define the whole cost, time, plan in the beginning of the project. And that is why it is called predictive life cycle. Now, how can you do that? If you have good understanding of your domain, if you have been working on similar kind of projects before, then you have a sufficient amount of knowledge base, data, past lesson learned, which can help you to predict how this project execution is going to be done. So if you are working on a known domain, if you know your problems and solutions well, if you have a good estimation data, estimation model in place, you can easily follow predictive life cycle. But if you are working in an abstract domain where your requirement or exact specification of a product will evolve as you move forward, it is difficult to apply predictive life cycle. Now, this is a one dimension of scope I spoke about. When I know my scope quite well in the advance, I end up doing a lot of planning in the beginning. So plan is something which is done in the beginning of predictive life cycle. And once I have a detailed plan, I will give to an execution team. I will bring a lot of people to the execution team since the plan is pretty well defined, and they people will do an execution, and finally the closing will be done. And that is how the predictive life cycle usually works. I usually don't like changes in predictive life cycle. Since I know the requirement well, I will put a stringent change management process. If somebody wants to change something, it should take proper approval because it was already planned. So predictive life cycle discourages changes. Predictive life cycle kind of assumes the fixed scope, fixed timelines, fixed costing kind of mindset, and they just believe in plan and then doing an execution. The second life cycle comes is an iterative life cycle. Assuming we don't know exactly what problem how the product will look like at the end. We do have an idea. It's not like we are going blind, but we do understand that customer behavior will evolve during the project duration, and we need to understand how customer respond to it, because we are solving a problem which is pretty much unknown. There is no historical data which can tell that if you develop something like this, it will sell or it will solve the problem of the customers. So we need to evolve based on what we learn as we start doing development, and those learning has to be taken in account for our costing and duration estimate as we move forward. Then we start following something called iterative life cycle. So in an iterative life cycle, we may start with, okay, initially we may have a requirement which looks like this, and we may run an iteration, then we take it to the customers. The customers tell, no, we don't want a circle, we want something like this. That is what we understand. Then we go for another iteration, and then finally we understand that customer was looking for something like this. So it's like the scope is getting refined, evolved, and this is getting evolved based on the feedbacks we are receiving, and that is why we are iterating. Iterative development is a planned rework development. We do plan to rework, that's why we are taking feedback. If we know in advance that this is what the customer needs, then we can follow the predictive life cycle. Since we don't know what the customer exactly needs, that's why we are going in iterations, and the iteration duration may vary. There is no particular guideline. In some projects, people end up running 3 months iterations, and when we go towards more adaptive, we start running the shorter iteration. So when the word iterative comes in mind, we need to think something we are addressing little bit an abstract concept. We will learn as we move forward. We will change our scope, and time and cost estimation will get refined as we move forward. We can't baseline the cost and time in the beginning of the project as we were doing in predictive life cycle. So this is an iterative. The third thing is incremental. So incremental life cycle is something that where we do know the scope in the beginning. We understand this is something we need to build. This is what the scope is. But we don't want to attack the whole problem in a one go, and we may want to say that this part we will develop first. So in a first increment, we may deliver this part of the system. In the second increment, we may deliver the remaining little bit additional part of the system. In the further fourth increment, we may deliver the final component. So it's like, I know what is needed, I can predict the requirement, I can define the scope well, and the project will only get completed when I reach to the final stage, and it is planned in a way that we deliver something so people can start using it, people can start make of it. So assuming that you are building a multi-complex official residential township, and you decide that the complete township will have a 10 towers. You build one tower and you roll it out. People start staying in the first tower. Then you start working on the second tower. Then you start working on the third tower. You have planned the whole city in advance, the complete sewage line, electricity, water supply is planned for the 10 towers. But the life cycle is incremental. You are not building the whole 10 tower in a one go and handing over the whole city to the resident. Rather, you are building tower by tower and rolling out tower by tower, and finally all the 10 towers done, you finish the project. If you follow this approach, it becomes incremental. If you follow the approach where you build the whole 10 towers and give it to the end customer at a one stage, you are becoming more like a productive life cycle. So this is how it is. The adaptive life cycle. So many times mixing of incremental and iterative becomes adaptive, and the learning is so fast. In case of iterations, we may learn after 3 months, 4 months. When we go for adaptive life cycle, we start changing the scope based on customer expectation on a weekly basis. So we maintain some log of customer requirement, and initially the requirement may look like this. We develop this, customer says, no, I need something like this. We develop that, then customer says, no, this is something like this I need. Then finally we understand this is something like this it is needed. In between, this is how we iterate. Sometimes we end up making a product which is directly get used without modification to a next stage, but the change pace is very high. It's like a change driven life cycle where we decide what has to be developed based on what was developed in the previous iteration, and the iteration durations may becomes of 2 weeks to 4 weeks times. Now we do have an annexure which talks about a lot on agile. Frameworks like Scrum are the one which fits more towards adaptive life cycle, where we have collection of requirement and we iterate and we develop things incrementally. So in a simple way, it's an iterative and incremental way of doing things, but the pace of change is so fast that we are changing the direction on weekly basis rather than on 2 months or 3 months basis. The planning is more or less a continuous activity. We finalize the plan for 2 weeks time, then we again plan for the remaining 2 weeks. We may have a broad plan which gives us a roadmap kind of a direction, but continuous planning and continuous learning is something is a characteristics of adaptive life cycle. The final one is a hybrid, which is added in PMBOK 6, is something a combination of all these. Now in many projects you may have some fixed requirement, you know this is something is needed. You may have some requirements which need to be learned as you go forward, you need to iterate. So when you have combination of such needs and stakeholder expectation, you come up with a process which is a life cycle which is hybrid in nature, which has elements from various these approaches. Now, your life cycle will be depending upon your domain. These categorization of predictive, incremental, iterative, adaptive and hybrid gives you a view of thinking. If you are preparing for your PMP exam, you need to keep in mind when we say that we are doing planning, we also need to think which life cycle we are in. Many test takers end up doing a mistake when they think planning has to be done only in the beginning, and after that we will do just an execution, but that is not true. It could be true in predictive life cycle. Even in predictive life cycle some amount of planning will continue, but it is drastically false when we talk about adaptive or incremental or iterative life cycles. So be aware that we need to see the context when we decide how sure we are on plan, what approach we take for the changes. The approach for changes would be very controlling type when we are in a predictive life cycle. Approach for changes would be very welcoming type when we are in adaptive life cycle. So when we learn the subject, we need to keep this information in mind. So this is what I wanted to talk about project life cycles and development life cycles.